And company have been started and failed. I don't think it's something to be taken lightly because there are not many, but a sizable number of patients who had those implants that are no longer supported when the company fails. You're settled with a problem that cannot be really addressed effectively.
The big vision is probably, if you're an engineer, is like how can you build an eye? Like a replacement eye is probably the holy grail, right? Is that discussed? Like when you go to this conference, is there like a panel or whatever on building an eye? Is that a commonly discussed thing? I know there have been like a couple of efforts of making a retina or something like that.
Yeah, there are efforts in building components of the eye. Artificial cornea is probably at some point reachable. There are implants to replace the natural outflow tracts of the trabecular meshwork that's somewhat working. And of course, intraocular lens is widely used, and that's been very successful. Building a retina is very difficult and fraught with risk. Optic nerve, I think almost impossible. Brain interface, maybe, actually somewhat more plausible, but also I think pretty far away in terms of really replacing the function of the natural eye. There are also people doing whole eye transplants, which also sounds pretty far-fetched. I don't predict that it will be successful in this 100 years because of the problem with nerve regeneration. You have to really solve that fundamental biological problem before you can tackle these specific applications.
You're saying that the problem is that the connection, the nerve connection between the eye and the brain doesn't basically regenerate.
Right. That's extremely difficult because it's not just the stimulating that nerve to grow, they have to form the proper connections. And that's a very special process that very difficult to recapitulate. I think replacing the eye with the transplant or implant is not something I'm working on now because I don't see it coming to fruition in the next few decades.
What's the limitation? Like if you have BCI type connection to something that's sensing photons, what's like the limitation? Is it the number of neurons that you're activating? Is it something else? What do you think is the fundamental limitation? If you can do Neuralink, why can't you do iLink? Is the
Or you
number?
mean like bypassing directly? If you're
No,
like
let's say you put into the eye a camera and the camera has electrodes or something that connect to the neurons that send optical data into your brain. I'm just like, is there like a fundamental problem? For example, you need this many bits of data, the eye takes in this many bits, but like the Neuralink can do 1/100000th of that or whatever. Is it like a million neurons, but you can only connect to 10 or whatever? Is there some kind of like huge wall that has to be overcome?
That has been done. Subretinal and epiretinal implants have been developed and tried, and they do work to some extent. It gives you a low resolution, rudimentary type of vision that's not natural.
Like dark spots, light spots, that
Yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah. The electrodes are not dense enough, and we don't really know how to encode the signal so that the vision you get is natural. And company have been started and failed. I don't think it's something to be taken lightly because there are not many, but a sizable number of patients who had those implants that are no longer supported when the company fails. You're settled with a problem that cannot be really addressed effectively. Hopefully, some deep pockets, maybe Neuralink can develop something that can be sustained. But even big companies abandon projects that are not really ready to make commercial profit.
There's a startup called Science, which is one of the founders of Neuralink started this company. But I think their approach, I don't understand how it applies to humans, but they do like an optical approach to stimulating the nerve. So there's a camera and then I don't know if they're still doing eyes. Maybe they've changed. But you have to genetically modify the neurons because to accept optical signals, they need to be genetically modified.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how that works in humans. That's two things now together where you have to do gene therapy and then you have to do an implant. It's like the ultimate thing to get through the FDA. But that's one that I've heard of that looks pretty cool.
Optogenetics is interesting because even though, like you said, it requires two difficult technologies, it actually may be safer because you're not implanting a foreign body in the eye. Or gene therapy is foreign, but it's
not like a foreign
it's not a
mechanical
hardware
system. Yeah.
that can detach, can cause infection, and
But talking about hardware, you were also mentioning intraocular lenses, and these are typically nowadays static, like they have one or maybe two or three focal points. How likely do you think, or how easy, difficult is it to have adaptive implants, adaptive optics implants, because they will have to attach to the muscle that's already in your eye? Is that
yeah.
even possible?
There are several groups working on that. Also, at about the same time that OCT was being developed, it's not quite ready yet. I think it's definitely possible. You just have to find something with the right compliance, the right connection to the muscles, and that's durable. The long-term biological reaction to it and neuroadaptation are probably somewhat difficult. I don't know. But it's not something easy because smart people have been working on it for decades. I see that that's something that it's plausible to have a breakthrough. But in terms of things that are hot besides direct connection to neurons is obviously artificial intelligence. And I think if you were wanting to make a clinical impact, that would be one area that has high likelihood of success. And certainly interpreting OCT or OCT angiography images and making diagnosis of not only eye diseases but systemic diseases is likely to succeed with artificial intelligence. And that's a big area of research that we're engaged in. And that's certainly a hot topic everywhere.
Are there any resources which you would recommend? Because for training AI tools, we need a lot of data. And I know like in medical fields, this is the main constraint, that it's hard to get enough data for training those models. If you can cover some of that part, what should the AI engineers do?
I think at this stage, there's a lot of work in building electronic health records, including advanced imaging like OCT, so that they are easily accessible and AI ready, either through centralized database or federated learning. You can access the images and have knowledge of their format in some standardized way, so you can use them to train neural networks. And that kind of infrastructure, foundational work is being done right now. Yeah, OCT is a little bit hard in that the images are not quite the same as photographs or video, ordinary images, so that it doesn't transfer as easily. But there are smart people working on that, and I don't think that it would be insurmountable. That's a relatively easy problem compared to regenerating the optic nerve, for example.
Have you in your lab perhaps already used this relatively new technology called a meta lens? There was a Nature Photonics paper on it where at the end of an OCT, normally it is a ball lens, which has spherical aberration. So now if you put a meta surface, you can quite easily correct those aberrations. Is this something that it does help with clarity of the image, but is it something that you see becoming a standard for OCT, or what is typically used instead in terms of optics to improve or suppress aberrations?
Yeah, I think that sounds like something that would be very useful for small probes, intravascular probe or endoscopic probes. Definitely think that would be useful.
I feel like for also the one who involved with research and production of the meta surfaces, it sounds like OCT is one of the like perfect applications because of the bandwidth. It doesn't require like the full spectrum. So if it's within 50 nanometers bandwidth, that should be good enough, because usually that's the weak spot of the meta optics, that it's confined to narrow wavelength ranges.
I see.
But in this case, sounds like perfectly suits. But of course, there could be further nuances and further details to be considered.
And I don't know if that's useful for integrated optics. Is that another use? I'm asking you.
You can integrate it, but it is out of plane. So in integrated optics, like your interferometer would be in the chip plane. So these lenses, they would be out of plane either at the end of the chip. So
Yeah.
assembling that would not be trivial. You could do that like out of the chip plane, but then it's more like a regular grating out coupler than a meta lens. It is possible, but it's more useful for when you have a sensor to have a meta surface on top of that to then project into the sensor. Yeah.
I think it's better to have two like separate modules. Let's say one which uses integrated photonics for like processing the signal, and then the optics, meta optics would use for collection.
Yeah, at the end of like the fiber probe.
Exactly.